I have some long-standing interest. What research has shown over many decades is that managers do not deliberately make value-destroying decisions, meaning that, if you look at entrepreneurial firms, even if you look at large companies, right, they all started from something. They all started with an entrepreneurial idea, with an opportunity, and then grew. So, they start from innovative, creative, entrepreneurial origins. But over time, what tends to happen is that the business formalizes in response to challenges.
Not many academics can say their research has shaped how we understand entrepreneurship across industries, from startups to family businesses, and even influenced how firms balance innovation and growth. Today's guest is one of those rare scholars who work sits right at the intersection of entrepreneurship, strategy, and innovation. Welcome to another episode of School to Startup, brought to you by Tracxn, a private market intelligence platform that's been supporting global university ecosystem for over 12 years. And through our university partnerships, we work with institutions driving innovation and entrepreneurship. And this series highlights the academic leaders making that happen. I'm Harish, your host today, and joining us is Professor Matt Shols, Distinguished Professor and Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at University of Leicester School of Business in UK. Matt, it's great to have you with us today.
Great. Thank you very much, Harish. It's really nice to join you and be part of the School to Startup series. Thank you.
Perfect. So you have spent years researching entrepreneurial behavior, innovation strategies, and how firms grow. So I have to ask you, if we locked you in a room with, say, 10 startup founders and 10 MBA students, who do you think would escape first? And who would still be there writing a business plan?
That's a really interesting question. It's a really, really interesting question. Mainly because the audience that you described is really diverse, and not everyone necessarily wants to be an entrepreneur or is willing to absorb the risk of it. And one of the things, though, not from my own research as such, but we've learned over the years in entrepreneurship research is that entrepreneurs see risk very differently. So something that is maybe risky to you and I would just be seen as fairly ordinary to an entrepreneur. So, that calibration of risk is different. And so when if I am locked in a room with lots of different people, be they students, entrepreneurs, business people, MBAs, who might get the entrepreneurship bug, it could be from, across any one of of those rooms. I think with MBAs, teaching MBAs is a lot of fun because I think of it as playing like a host, a TV show host, because you want to get some information over to them, at the same time give them plenty of space to share their experience. But oftentimes they will see the world of their business and the markets in a very particular way because they have so much experience of that business and industry and markets that sometimes they can't see what lies outside the boundaries. And so, that's why I have a background, for example, in teaching corporate entrepreneurship. So, if somebody doesn't want to start their own business, they can still be intrapreneurs inside their businesses and make such a big difference. So I suppose my answer to your question would be there is no escape. So that's one way of looking at it. So.
Amazing. So could you please tell us a bit about your journey into academia? What first drew you into studying entrepreneurship and innovation?
Sure. No, thanks for that question. It's an interesting one. So my whole family has a background in entrepreneurship and in family businesses. So my grandparents used to run their own family business, involving some of their children, and then that split into other parts of the family as well. But that was on my mother's side, and then on my father's side, my dad started his own business when I was very young, which my mum actually got involved in. So my dad started his own construction business, having been made redundant, and then my mum used to work for a big bank in the UK, so she brought some finance and accounting skills that my dad lacked. So that became its own family business, and that business grew and continued through to my dad's retirement. Where when he retired, for example, he was doing work for the National Trust in the UK because he was traditionally trained as a traditional bricklayer, and so he had skills that had been almost like forgotten in the market. So, but what was interesting is that Dad always told me and my twin brother not to go into the family business because construction and building takes a heavy toll on the body. So he encouraged us not to go down that road, but. Funnily enough, me and my brother Paul were among the first, well, actually, we were the first from the family to go to university. And before we did, when we were finishing school, we were thinking of starting our own business. So we were start thinking of, we were, 15, 16. We thought of opening a video game shop. But our physics teacher, he had a real belief in me and my brother and really encouraged us to go to university. But, we were from a poor background. We had no history of it in the family. We didn't really have the resources, but we were last in to get government grants to support us to go to university. So we did business, and it turns out that was our calling. We did business studies. We both did business studies. Then at the end of our undergraduate degree, we then thought of starting another business, which was going to be like a consultancy, research consultancy type business. But then this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we realized, we don't know a great deal about e-commerce. We need to learn more about e-commerce. And we were lucky to get, there was grants from the Welsh government. I'm originally from Wales at the time for Welsh students to study master's programs. So we got to do a master's with financial support. And then a new professor joined the university where we were studying. His name was Professor Rob Morgan, who's in Cardiff. And Rob really, I don't know, he clearly saw something in me and Paul, and he really, really encouraged us to do PhDs, and we did. And funnily enough, I chose entrepreneurship not necessarily because of my family background, but because through my education, I hadn't learned much about entrepreneurship. And I have this natural, inquisitive, curious mind. And so I decided, hey, I'm going to do a PhD on entrepreneurship because why not? And that's what I did. And then the rest is history. My brother, actually, I mentioned him deliberately. He's a professor of strategy. And so, we are both professors. He's in strategy. I'm in entrepreneurship. And, we've had the pleasure of teaching together sometime, and we dovetail between him bringing the strategy side and me bringing the entrepreneurship side. And sometimes we argue in class and things on different mindsets. But it's fun. But yeah, it is. So that's how I ended up in academia. And if I wasn't in academia, I can guarantee you I would be an entrepreneur. I would be running my own business, because both give me a degree of freedom that I need, that kind of like lack of micromanagement and autonomy that I absolutely need. So, yeah.
Very, very interesting. And before we deep dive into, conversation, this is for our viewers. If you're enjoying this discussion on entrepreneurship and innovation, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Tracxn YouTube channel so you don't miss future conversations with global academic leaders and entrepreneurs. All right, Matt, coming back to you, you have published extensively on entrepreneurship, innovation, and strategy. What are some of the research areas or projects you are currently most excited about?
Great, no, thanks. I have some long-standing interests. So, for example, the very first few works that I wrote about were on the concept of entrepreneurial orientation, which is disclaimer early on, most of my research and most of my interest looks at the firm, the entrepreneurial firm, rather than the entrepreneurial individual. So rather than thinking or researching solely the entrepreneur, the founder that starts the business, I'm very interested in how firms of all sizes grow and remain entrepreneurial, because what typically happens, and again, what research has shown over many decades, is that managers do not deliberately make value-destroying decisions, meaning that, if you look at entrepreneurial firms, even if you look at large companies, right, they all started from something. They all started with an entrepreneurial idea, with an opportunity, and then grew. So, they start from innovative, creative, entrepreneurial origins. But over time, what tends to happen is that the business formalizes in response to challenges. So, for example, we're a new venture. We lack resources, we lack the knowledge to compete intelligently, and we lack legitimacy. So we're constantly firefighting. Entrepreneurs will say they work 25 hours a day if they had it. They would work 8 days a week if they could. You see where I'm going with this. And that's because they're firefighting so many things. And then what they do is, okay, if we're going to crystallize growth, we need to bring in expertise, bring in resources, and then we need to structure that. We need to give it a focus. So you start seeing specialization. You start seeing someone dedicated to sales, finance, operations, or what have you, and you get this formalization. These days, you can outsource a lot of that. You can, to a certain extent, use AI. You can use outsourced services. You can use other businesses' spare capacity. But the fact remains that you're formalizing the business. Now, you're doing that in response to the growth challenge. But in doing this, you are inadvertently starting the formalization of the business that starts to diminish that freedom for entrepreneurship, that creativity for innovation. So it's a natural response to a problem. You start to formalize to help power growth. So, this goes back to what I was saying, that over time, firms lose their innovativeness and entrepreneurship. So my interest was always, so how do we change that? How do we build, organize, manage, and sustain the entrepreneurial and innovative business? So I always focused on the firm. Some of my research looks at the individual, but most of the firm. And that's because, hey, we don't want to leave everything to the stereotypical heroic entrepreneurial founder. There's lots of entrepreneurial talent across the business. So we should be harnessing that. Why have it locked in one pot or area when you can capitalize across the business? So that's where entrepreneurial orientation comes in. It's how do you transfer the entrepreneurial mindset of the founder or the entrepreneurial individual and put that across the company? What processes do you put in place? What activities? How do you, increase its risk tolerance, its innovativeness, and its more pioneering properties? So that's one of the things I'm really interested in. But at the same time, one of my most recent works on entrepreneurial orientation, I'll give you the very quick story of it. Entrepreneurial orientation largely assumes we increase risk-taking, innovativeness, and proactiveness across the company. And if we do this, we will increase firm performance. But my argument recently was, well, actually, no. If you get beyond a certain point, that excessive risk-taking, innovativeness, and proactiveness can become self-destructive, and it can burn resources very quickly, and it might actually herald failure, not just success. So entrepreneurship shouldn't be assumed to be a panacea, a great solution to everything. It has dangers. And so I actually used physics, because I again, go back to my physics teacher that I told you about earlier. My way of honoring him was I had a paper on entrepreneurial entropy in entrepreneurship theory and practice, where I argued actually we can use the second law of thermodynamics to understand what is going on here. Basically, the work that the entrepreneurs do inside the business exhausts resources, consumes energy in producing work that has a highly uncertain outcome. So it's not always that the firm will grow and the firm will be successful. What you get is these waves where you can be very successful, but also, potentially have innovation failures. And the aggregate assumption is that they'll even out and you'll keep doing well, but in extremes it can go wrong. So that is one of my big interests at the minute is, okay, so what can go wrong, and then how do we stop that? is the easiest way of describing it. So.
Very interesting. Your research explores how social networks influence entrepreneurial decision making as well. So from your perspective, how much does an entrepreneur's network influence their willingness to take risk? Is entrepreneurship sometimes more about who you know than what you know?
That is a really, really good question. So you're right. Lots of my research, all the way from my PhD actually, looked at social capital and relational capital and the role of networks for entrepreneurs. I agree with the general thrust of what you were saying there, is that networks are extremely important to an entrepreneur. There is no doubt about it. The reason being that, as I said at the beginning, entrepreneurs are resource poor typically. So you need a really powerful network to help you access resources, but also to access ideas, access information, things that can help you learn more quickly the art of doing business, growing the business, and gap fill where the entrepreneur has gaps in their expertise. I mean, entrepreneurs are not necessarily great managers, but need to be, and at the same time, they might bring a certain specific expertise or enthusiasm for opportunities, but lack certain technical expertise. So networks are critical. My way of looking at this is that you've got really two dimensions: potential and potency. Now, potential comes from having lots and lots of weak ties, lots of just like little connections that you just make. You get to know people, you keep those connections open. And that allows you, to have random conversations where you're just exposed to new ideas that can really drive some innovative thinking and some entrepreneurship. But you also have to, so you've got potential, but then you've got potency, right? So if you're going to get access to resources and really good ideas and really good information, then you need trust. People need to trust you and to know that, if I work with you and if I share something with you, you'll reciprocate. It won't be just a one-directional thing. And information absolutely totally travels. When I teach this, for example, I use this I've used it with undergrads, postgrads, executives, and beyond, and entrepreneurs. I use this game called the Win As Much As You Can game, where the idea is there's the scoring matrix, there's a method, you play certain things, and your job is to maximize your return, i.e. profit maximize. Inevitably, everyone underperforms, because for one to gain, another one is losing, and there's a zero sum happening. The reality, the trick of the game is that if everybody would have just collaborated in the first place, they all would have outperformed everybody else. But it's a great way of showing how information travels. Behaviors send signals. And this is what an entrepreneur needs to be super cautious about, is that networks are super powerful, but they transmit signals, they transmit information. So potential and potency are key. The other thing that I would say, as always, there's a second side to the coin, which is that sometimes you can learn the wrong thing, or learn information that may have worked for one, but may not work for you. And you end up, instead of taking calculated risks, you're actually taking an inappropriate risk. So a good example of this, I used this in my teachings, I came across it and I thought, is this real? But it was real. And it was a little bakery in London where, in talking to other businesses, they learned that, well, if I do an offer through the app called Groupon, coupons, then it will drive traffic to my business. So they made an offer, which was basically, if I buy 6 cupcakes, I get 6 cupcakes for free. Great. And it did exactly what was predicted. It drove traffic to the bakery. The problem is that it was so popular and oversubscribed that it nearly bankrupted the business. So it's a perfect example of how, from a network, you can learn something really good and you think, yeah, that will work for me as well. But without thinking it through, it can actually be potentially bad. And it's a simple example, but I think it conveys the flip side of networks quite well. But without a doubt, every conversation I've ever had, including yesterday, we held a growth forum here at the school yesterday, and consistently networks came up as among the most important elements, and there's no doubt about it. You just have to be careful how you use them.
Right. Very interesting. On the other hand, with network comes the opportunity, right? So opportunity recognition is a big theme in entrepreneurship now. So from your research and experience working with entrepreneurs, what separates people who spot opportunities early from those who miss them entirely?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I would say there are 4 immediate things that can make a difference. One is how frequently are you scanning the environment? How are you scanning that environment? So, for instance, I run my own podcast series, but very recently, well, actually twice, I've interviewed Bob Chernow, who is one of the vice presidents of the World Future Society. So he's a futurist. And, in talking to Bob, I was thinking, how do you predict the future? Because you clearly can, you're a futurist, you predicted multiple trends. That's not too different to the entrepreneur, right? And so, things like science fiction or just reading lots of different information sources can make a big difference. And it can be overwhelming, but at the same time, it's giving you the opportunity to see the world through different perspectives and through other people's eyes. So environmental scanning for me, you're looking at what are the trends going on in the marketplace, but look at what trends are going on in other marketplaces, in other industries, sectors, market segments, what's going on there? Are there new products, services, or new ideas or tech breakthroughs in those areas that might inform your interest? So it might be that I have an interest in one particular market, but I can learn something from elsewhere. So environmental scanning is crucial. I mean, that gives you awareness, and then it's up to you as an individual how alert you are to that. But knowledge helps alertness. So that's one side. The next thing is you've got to be sensitive to weak signals. And there is this phenomenon called peripheral vision. So if I'm just fixated on what my peers are doing or what my competitors are doing, then I'm going to become essentially myopic. My vision, instead of being broad, is going to be narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow. And I'm just going to become fixated on what are these guys doing? And why, and how do I cope with that, and how do I deal with it? In doing that, I then miss the peripheral signals, the weak signals that are going on around me. This happens to, this is the downside of experience. Experience is great because it allows you to understand the trends in the market, what they might mean, where markets might go, how competitors might react. But there is this phenomenon called the Icarus paradox, which I especially like. The Icarus paradox is where your greatest strength becomes your greatest weakness. And so if we think about this in terms of experience is great, gives you lots of knowledge, lots of insight into how things work. But they make you fixated in the belief that that's how they will always work. And that's not strictly the case, because it can blind you to what's going on outside. Really good example. It's an old example, but one I often use simply because it tells the story really, really well. Is, if you imagine the original iPod and iTunes that Apple created, how on earth did Sony not create iPod and iTunes before Apple did? They had all the potential technology, they had the presence in the music industry, but that's because they were fixated on these are our technologies, these are our core competencies. So they played the strategy playbook, which was protect your competitive advantages. What they didn't do was use the entrepreneurial mindset to think, hey, how might these technologies really change the market? How might they shake things up? Could everything that we're doing become redundant? So you really got to look at the weak signals. Oh, and by the way, the weak signal for iTunes and iPod, Apple looked at the fact that people were buying computers and then buying CD burners to put in their computers. So they used CD burner data as the weak signal. And they thought, oh, why are people doing that? Oh, well, people buy iMacs to do video editing. So they're buying CD burners for videoing. No, when they looked at what the behavior was, they found that people were ripping CDs and making digital music versions. So, that was the weak signal. And but it shows you how you need to be wary of those things. The final thing I would say is, I think sometimes entrepreneurs become fixated on technology pioneering, rather than remembering that a lot of innovation comes from technology integration, where you take existing technologies and innovate something new out of them. It's much less risk. You can start to predict the innovation on the market, and it can be really, really successful. You don't always need to be pushing completely brand new technologies all the time, or the most powerful technologies. So I would say those are the three things.
Very interesting. And many of our viewers are students or aspiring founders. So what are the most effective ways universities can nurture entrepreneurial thinking and innovation among students today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I can explain a bit of what we do in the University of Leicester, but at the same time, I think I'll also flag a couple of I would say some general points to begin with. I mean, in terms of what we should be doing in terms of education, I think it's really important that we realize that not all students are the same. But also, they even have a completely different understanding a lot of the time as to what entrepreneurship actually is. Sometimes we take for granted that the word entrepreneurship has a universal meaning. It doesn't. There are lots of different ways of defining it, and even taking a different vantage point that would then completely change how someone thinks of new venture creation and startups. So I think the first thing we've got to do is understand, we need to calibrate the baseline. We need to make clear that, okay, there are different views of entrepreneurship. The other thing, and this is something that has come out in my own research, is that experiential teaching is so important. So it's not just the theory and ideas around entrepreneurship, but giving students every possible opportunity, be that through guest speakers, case studies, action-based learning, problem-based learning, to practice the art of behaving like an entrepreneur, analyzing the environment, thinking of opportunities, being challenged on those opportunities to think, actually, is that the correct opportunity? Why do you want to do it that way? And actually stress testing those things. The other thing that I think is crucial is, I mentioned earlier that good entrepreneurs are not necessarily good managers. I mean, oftentimes they're not, because they're not necessarily even taught in management skills or business skills. They may not have business acumen. So they may rely on the entrepreneurial team around them. And that goes back to networking. If you're a student, who's your first network? Well, it's going to be your former classmates, so, and the more exposed you are to that. So I think from a program perspective, we need more experiential level learning, taking students out of the classroom as well, but more interactive problem-driven learning scenarios, but also one that realizes we need a really well joined up curriculum. So that when we're teaching entrepreneurship, we're teaching that alongside strategy, because without a strategy and a long-term vision, the entrepreneur is like just random. The danger of the entrepreneurial mind is that every opportunity becomes attractive when you need the strategy toolkit next to that to decide, actually, there are some opportunities are worth pursuing, some are not. Understand why that's the case, but also understand that not everything has to be done today. You can timeline these in a strategic growth plan about when you exploit certain opportunities and how you grow the business. So I think those things need to dovetail. Would be my immediate some thoughts on that. And of course, obviously, you need to nurture an entrepreneurial mindset, but that goes without saying.
Amazing. You might have answered my other question as well, but still I'll ask. Since this series is called School to Startup, for students and aspiring students watching this episode, what advice would you give someone who is still in university but dreaming about building a startup one day?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I mean, my first point would be, universities, many universities, particularly in the UK, and some universities maybe more than others, but generally speaking, there is a strong passion for entrepreneurship. When I was at university doing my undergrad, the entrepreneurship education was still very new. It was actually only when around the time when I did my master's, for example, that the university I was studying and introduced a new master's in entrepreneurship, and now they're pretty commonplace. So the first thing a student should be doing is, there is a lot of support structure within universities around entrepreneurship, and just engage with that. So for example, I'll give some examples just from the University of Leicester. I mean, we very much take an ecosystem approach to supporting entrepreneurship. So we know that we need to inspire, develop, and accelerate students and graduates to become entrepreneurs. Not everyone wants a corporate career. Some people want to go into entrepreneurship. Equally, somebody might want to go into a corporate career now, but still have that interest and desire for an entrepreneurial career in the future. So, connecting with the resources and events that go on in universities. And we have an enterprise cafe, we do hackathons, we do consultancy challenges, we do idea sessions. We have entrepreneurship as part of our career exhibitions. We do startup and side hustle competitions. A lot of universities in the UK have entrepreneurs in residence programs as well. We even have dedicated co-working or incubating space for students. So, take advantage of those opportunities and get to, even if it's in a test bed scenario, live the life of an entrepreneur for a little bit in that kind of like safety net structure, so that you can explore those options and see how to do it well, what you can learn. And there are entrepreneurship competitions that are run, if not by your university, then by others worldwide that teams can enter. That's another thing to consider. So I think these things are important because, in the events that we held yesterday, somebody made a good point. There's no playbook on how to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's a very fair point, because we can teach it. We can teach it very well. We can create lots of support structures, but everybody's experience of it is different. And if you get to test those things out in a university environment while they're still a student, the student is generating and equipping themselves with so many skills that they don't yet realize, and they will be very valuable further down the line. So I think that is the most important piece of advice I would want to give, is that there is so much potential support inside universities. Just engage with it, absolutely engage with it. It's there for you.
Amazing. This was incredible. Thank you very much, Matt. This conversation gave us some fascinating insights especially from how entrepreneurial networks shape decision making to how innovation and strategy drive the growth of startups, and of course, how universities can play a powerful role in nurturing the next gen of entrepreneurs. A big thank you to Professor Matt for being part of this episode of School to Startup. And to all our viewers, if you have enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Tracxn YouTube channel and click the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was incredible.